Hey friends, I'm Ginny D and I have ADHD, and there's a very good chance that you, the person watching this, have it too. I say that because I get a lot of comments from people about how their ADHD has affected the way they play tabletop games. The truth is, games like D&D can be really challenging for people like us. Sessions require long hours of sitting still and paying attention to something that only exists in your head. There are times during roleplay or combat where you are not specifically involved, but are still not supposed to get distracted. Not to mention that it's a complex game that requires literal textbooks of knowledge, much of which has to be remembered and held in your mind all at once. In a lot of ways, D&D specifically pushes on all the weaknesses of the ADHD mind. But at the same time, tabletop games are really popular with neurodivergent people. They allow us to express ourselves, build community, and be impulsive or experimental without real-life consequences. So how do we reconcile this? How can people with ADHD deal with our differences so that we can experience the games we love without stress and struggle and shame? Navigating tabletop games with ADHD is a journey. Thankfully, I have a map. But first, everyone experiences ADHD differently. Some of us deal with hyperactivity or impulsivity. Personally, my symptoms mostly fall under the inattentive category. Some people struggle specifically with math or memory or rejection sensitivity. Some people have ADHD and don't struggle with any part of D&D. This video won't solve every problem for every person. Instead, I want to share some ideas and help you identify what you need in order to be successful in your own tabletop games, and learn how to ask for those things. Looks like the first stop on our journey is the Forest of Focus. Let's check it out. One of the biggest struggles for people with ADHD is focus, but it's not necessarily that we can't focus, it's that we can't regulate our focus. That's why sometimes we struggle to pay attention, while other times we fixate or hyperfocus, neither of which is fully within our control. And this isn't just a feeling we have, this is a chemical difference in our brains. Research suggests that people with ADHD actually have lower levels of the neurotransmitters and hormones related to focus. What that means is that sometimes sitting in one spot and paying attention to a D&D game for hours at a time is really hard, even if we love the game and are interested in what's happening. And this gets exponentially harder during the parts of the game where we aren't directly engaged, like when it's not our turn in combat, or when our character isn't actively involved in a scene. So how can you make it easier to focus during games? One of the most common coping strategies is fidgeting. If you're the kind of person who has a habit of tapping your foot or chewing on a pen, you're basically already doing it. Research has shown that fidgeting can make it easier for people with ADHD to focus. That's because ADHD minds lose focus when they're understimulated, and sitting still is basically the definition of understimulating. Occupying yourself with some small activity helps keep your brain active so you don't check out. But there is a line to walk here. A fidget shouldn't take up so much of your attention that you tune out the game. It's also really important that your fidgeting isn't distracting to other players. Some popular options are knitting or crocheting, doodling, or playing with a fidget toy. Personally, I take really unnecessarily detailed notes, like I keep a color-coded spreadsheet of all the NPCs we meet, and another one tracking our quests, plus weekly session notes. It kind of gamifies paying attention for me because each different piece of information needs to be categorized in a different document. For some people, a mindless phone game meets this need, but I do think it's worth mentioning that our phones are created specifically to distract us, so be mindful of how you're using your phone and use your notification settings and focus modes to make sure that you're not setting yourself up for failure. And on the topic of setting yourself up for failure, it's also harder to focus when you're uncomfortable, or tired, or hungry. Pay attention to what your body needs in order to support your brain. Maybe that means making sure that you eat before sessions, or bring snacks, or making sure that you wear comfortable clothes. I know we can't always control whether or not we get enough sleep, but if you know that you're not a morning person, maybe don't sign on for a D&D game that starts early. Personally, I try not to play D&D in the evenings because I'm a little baby and I get sleepy at 8 p.m. I also wanted to repeat something that really stuck with me after watching the video on the How to ADHD channel about tabletop gaming. In this video, clinical psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Kilmer points out that for those of us who have prescription medication for our ADHD, we're often told to take take this medication to help with work or with school, but sometimes our social activities or hobbies also require focus, and it's okay to take your meds before D&D if it helps you engage with the game. As Dr. Kilmer says, you're allowed to have the same kind of support for your hobbies as you are for your work or your school. Now, you might be thinking, oh, so your tip for focus is to do whatever helps us focus. Great. And I get it. It sounds obvious. But a lot of us with ADHD have spent our lives being told that our symptoms would disappear if we just tried harder, or that the methods we use to cope are wrong or not allowed. So part of this is just me giving you permission to set yourself up for success. It's not shameful to need help to focus on D&D. It doesn't mean that you don't care about the game or that you're not trying hard enough. Equip yourself with the tools you need to give your brain a fighting chance. And speaking of tools, it is time to visit the next place on our map. Welcome to the Simplicity Citadel. Some people insist that D&D is not a complicated game, but I don't think it's in any way irrational to be overwhelmed or intimidated by a game that requires a textbook to play, especially if you have a neurodevelopmental disorder that impairs your memory and information processing. That's why the second stop on the journey to playing tabletop games with ADHD is to make the game easier. One way to do this is to organize the information that you need to play in a way that makes sense to you. There are a ton of resources out there to help you do this. People have redesigned character sheets to be color-coded or to use symbols and icons to make it easier to read. You might want to create a flowchart to help you decide exactly what to do during combat, or write your abilities on index cards so that you can look at the specific information that you need instead of the text wall of the whole sheet. Some people find that resources like D&D Beyond are easier to use than a paper character sheet. It even has digital dice and will add your modifiers for you, which can be a game changer for people who have a hard time with mental math. Personally, I created my own cheat sheet to make sure that I always have the information I need all collected in one spot, and in an order that makes sense to me. Mine is specifically for combat because that's where I tend to feel the most pressure. Everyone is waiting on me, and I hate when I realize after my turn is over that I had an ability I could have used but forgot about. For example, my barbarian has a feature called Instinctive Pounce, which lets me move up to half my speed when I enter a rage. On D&D Beyond, this feature is tucked away in the middle of a bunch of other miscellaneous abilities in the Features and Traits tab, but on my combat cheat sheet, I put it at the very top because it's something that I need to remember at the beginning of combat. Of course, some information is complicated no matter how you write it down. You might decide to avoid certain classes if that class's features are hard to wrap your head around. For example, in order for spellcasters to make decisions during gameplay, they either need a comprehensive understanding of their spells or the ability to read the text of a spell and quickly understand it. Either or both of these things might be challenging for someone with ADHD. Spell cards or even a printout of your spells might help, but some players prefer to just avoid spellcasting altogether. Personally, while I've played almost every type of caster, I tend to prefer playing casters with set spell lists, like warlocks or bards, rather than the kinds of casters who pick their spells every long rest, like clerics or druids. That way, I can make sure that I fully understand every spell that I have prepared. Now, you'll often hear people say that folks with ADHD struggle with object permanence. That isn't technically true because object permanence is about whether or not you understand that an object still exists when you can't perceive it, and obviously we understand that. Babies have object permanence before they're even a year old. But the reason that this phrasing is so common is because forgetfulness is a very common symptom of ADHD, and when you can't see something, it's a lot easier to forget about it. So regardless of what you want to call it, a lot of people with ADHD have an out of sight, out of mind problem. Here it is. This is something that the Azrai addresses in a lot of detail in his video about D&D and ADHD, which I'll link in the cards. He talks about how D&D is full of invisible information, not just the things we're supposed to picture in our minds, like locations and characters, but game mechanics too, like concentration on a spell, remembering where you fall in initiative order, or remembering when specific abilities become relevant. That's why I find it really helpful to have physical items to turn invisible game mechanics into visible cues. The most common example of this is using maps and minis, whether that be a gridded mat with lines drawn on it or full-on 3D terrain. I know some people really love theater of the mind, but I really struggle with it because it's very hard for me to hold all that information about the setting and the monsters in my mind, no matter how beautiful or detailed the DM's description is. But maps and minis are far from the only place that you can utilize physical props to aid your memory. You can use cards to make initiative order visible, condition rings to remember when somebody's hexed or stunned or paralyzed or blessed, a marker to remind you when you're concentrating on a spell. There are inspiration coins, there's bardic inspiration dice, less dice, there are all kinds of fun ways to keep track of your spell slots, like this Tome of Spell Storing from Dungeon Bones. There are tons of products that you can buy for this stuff, but you can also DIY any of this. You can use dice or buttons for miniatures, you can track initiative with folded scraps of paper, and of course, if you're playing online, all of these things can be done digitally. It doesn't need to be pretty, it just needs to externalize something that you're usually expected to remember. By now, you should have a pretty good idea of what you need to be successful when playing D&D, but you're not the only one at the table. So the final stop on our journey is my all-time favorite tavern, the Talking Tankard. Tabletop gaming is a social experience, which means it's crucial to communicate with your game master and your fellow players, both for your benefit and for theirs. Ideally, this conversation happens during session 0, but it's never too late to talk about it, and it needs to be an ongoing conversation, because everyone's needs and experiences shift over time. Real talk, I know it may seem easy for me to sit here and say, you don't need to be ashamed of how your brain works, as if that's just a switch you can flip. If your experience with ADHD has been anything like mine, you've spent your life being told that you're just lazy or stupid or not trying hard enough. And that's not easy to unlearn, but I hope in this specific context you can let yourself accept that some parts of tabletop gaming may be more difficult for you than for a neurotypical person. And that isn't your fault. It's okay to need help, and it's okay to ask for help. You can tell your game master and fellow players where your areas of difficulty lie, so they can be understanding and give you grace. You can ask for accommodations to be made, both inside and outside of the game. And it's worth noting, they can also say no. Maybe the things you need from a game aren't things that your game master or party can provide, and it's okay to choose not to play at a table that can't or won't accommodate you. You deserve to find a table where you can be yourself and enjoy the game without feeling the constant pressure to mask your symptoms and cosplay as a neurotypical person. I know it can be hard to ask for things, so let's go over a few requests together that might help players with ADHD. Obviously, not all of these accommodations will make sense for everyone. This isn't a substitute for an actual dialogue, it's just a starting point. You can borrow some of this language to talk to your own game master, or feel free to just link them directly to this video to start the conversation. Let's start with scheduling. Some people with ADHD suffer from time blindness, or may be chronically late. A flexible start time might help, or maybe a little reminder in the group chat before the session. Some players might benefit from shorter sessions if they have trouble maintaining focus for more than a few hours at a time. And regardless of session length, most players with ADHD, and let's be honest, other people too, find it helpful to take breaks. It could just be 5 minutes every half an hour or hour, just long enough to stand up, move around, and reset. If a player with ADHD has trouble remembering and keeping track of their materials, maybe the DM could hang on to stuff like their character sheet and dice and miniature in between sessions. For a forgetful player, detailed recaps before the session can help jog their memory. If another player takes notes, maybe those notes could be shared with the whole group for reference. Even if you normally have a low technology table, maybe a player with ADHD would benefit from digital tools, allowing them to use their phone or their laptop freely during games. While I love the immersion of background music or sound effects, that kind of thing might be distracting for a neurodivergent player. Similarly, side conversations amongst the party can make it really hard to focus on the main action. This may mean doing your best to limit distractions. When you need to catch the attention of a player with ADHD, they might ask that you call on them by name. This can be especially helpful in combat, particularly if you give them a heads up on the turn before theirs, so they have a quick second to refresh their memory on the battlefield and just make sure that they're ready for their turn. There may be certain obstacles within the game that are harder for a person with ADHD to work around. For example, some players really have a hard time with puzzles. That's why it's a good idea to provide multiple options for how to resolve a problem, and be prepared to turn any given challenge into a dice roll, so that if the player can't solve it, their character still can. Honestly, that's just a good DM habit overall. No matter what specific accommodations a player with ADHD may ask for, there's one that we should all get, and that's just understanding. For people who don't experience this disorder, it can be hard to wrap your head around. It might not look like someone with ADHD is listening or paying attention, even when they are. Something that seems easy for a neurotypical person may not be easy for someone who has ADHD. And even if you yourself have ADHD, that doesn't mean that you experience it exactly the same way that someone else does. If we want to enjoy playing together and connecting over tabletop games, we need to give each other some grace. Brains are weird, and we're all just doing our best. I've tried plenty of other tabletop games, and despite the parts of D&D that are hard for me, I can't help it. I just love it. It's my favorite game. But if you don't feel that way, you might want to experiment with tabletop games that have shorter sessions, lighter rules, easier gameplay. Or you can just play D&D differently. Maybe you'd prefer to play a drop-in character or an NPC, so you don't have to be present and engaged for the whole time every single session. We get to decide how we play D&D, so make it work for you. And of course, if you love D&D but find playing difficult, hey, maybe you'd have a better time DMing. I've heard a lot of people with ADHD say that they find running a game way more mentally stimulating than playing. Of course, then you'd have to deal with the session prep and organizing the information and insecurity about your performance, and maybe I need another video for that one.